see the email I sent earlier?
Yes, I did. I had a quick little look at the presentation and the list of topics. I must say
that's not what you want at all.
well, it's not quite that I don't want it. It's just a hell of a lot more technical than I'm currently sort of looking for. Despite studying TV for 3 years, things don't really go very much into technical depth because it's a course that's sort of half practical, half looking at science and journalism and all these other bits and pieces.
Okay.
So
no, that's what I sort of guessed looking at the when I then looked at exactly what you wanted to talk about. I thought, yes, yes. I mean, this is why when people join the BBC, if you're particularly joining our department, the first thing you do is go away for an intensive 6 weeks of learning what television is actually about on the technical side, because it's so totally different. So yes, so that's what I'm sort of deeply into. So if there is anything you need to know, I can answer it, I'm sure. But what you actually want to know is, what did you say about?
Well, I've written
3D
about
and UHD and.
I'm basically looking at I've been studying this for quite a few months now, and really, really intensively up to the end, obviously, because it's coming up to my deadline, so I'm really looking at consolidating all the information, and I must say I've learned so much in such a short period of time, and it's been really interesting, because before I only ever heard of ultra high definition and 4K as the next big thing, and then reading all about these conventions and the new compression format and all this thing, it's a lot of people are quite excited by it. So I really wanted to see, is it feasible really? Will it be the next big thing that these manufacturers are pushing it as? At CES specifically, I had a look at some of their notes and the articles written from that in Las Vegas quite recently, and 3D is out according to that, and 4K is in, big shiny 4K TV screens everywhere. So even though I do touch on the technical aspects of it, compared to the list of topics that you gave me, it's very brief. It's more looking at the consumer side of it. So, consumers, will they have the bandwidth for it? Will the TVs look impressive, but will the consumer really know that they have to sit a certain distance away to appreciate the resolution difference and all of that? So it does go into it in a technical way, but not nearly as much because,
Right, yeah, sure. No, that's fine. Okay, so my take on it at the moment is that the manufacturers, having had a great success in selling flat panel TVs, and I mean my work for a lot of the last 20 years, well, not so much recently, has been following the displays industry and seeing where it's going and at what point we were going to have to switch and start doing high definition, because we've been working on high definition for longer than I have, 25, 30 years, and when were we actually going to have to introduce it? Which was going to be governed by when the manufacturers actually started to sell the TV sets that consumers could actually take advantage of it. So that was the driving. That's why I spent 6 months working in Japan on display technology, to understand that industry, because it is the thing that drives it, or has done. And so it was only when flat panel displays started to get larger that we got to the need for high definition. The cathode ray tube was never going to get large enough to need high definition. So again, the work we did on video resolution and what the eye can see and how large the screen needs to be was sort of feeding into that as well. So a 28-inch CRT, you get some benefit from high definition, but it's not compelling. It doesn't need you to start broadcasting high definition. 40-inch displays, yes, was predicated on 3 times picture height viewing distance, super high vision 4K, 1.5 times picture height, super high vision 8K, 3/4 picture height. Now that actually isn't how people watch television. We did a study which showed that the average viewing distance was 2.7 metres, and as your screen gets larger, you don't get further away from it, or your living room doesn't get bigger.
Yeah.
The size of living room stays much the same, and the average viewing distance is going to stay much the same. So it's not 3 times picture height, it's 2.7 metres, depending on what screen size you have. But that's not the end of the story, because as the screens, the pixel arrangement on the screens, the red, green and blue vertical stripes, are not perfect Gaussian spots. On the cathode ray tube, we had this electron beam going across the screen. It was a Gaussian spot. It was a D to A converter in the digital world. You put digits in, and it converted into this analog spot with a nice Gaussian shape that was ideal for converting the digital signal into something that the eye was going to see. And then with a pixelated display in the digital world, it's a red stripe, a green stripe and a blue stripe, and the eye sees that as a sort of as a block, and then nothing, and then a block, and then in I don't know how much digital sampling theory you've done, probably not.
Not much.
And basically, what you need is a reconstruction filter, which, in terms of the human eye, is the imperfections of human eyesight, which means you have to get far enough away from it that what you see is a sort of a blurred thing rather than a digital block of red light and a block of green light and a rock. So you have to get far enough away that it all blends, and this is the basis behind Apple's retinal displays. The idea that the feature size of the display is much smaller than you would conventionally imagine. And I mean, the work that we did, that I touched on in that report, in the report that's quoted in that presentation I sent you, that you can simply interpret it. It tells you what size of pixel you want. In practice, it tells you what the resolution of the television system should be, and actually what you really need is a display of a higher resolution and a camera of a higher resolution than the display system. So that's a really hard message for the manufacturers, because they don't actually, they want to sell a 4K display.
Yeah.
And they would like us to have a 4K broadcasting system to feed that.
Yeah.
And to try to explain that actually a high definition television signal is pretty good on a 4K display, and is almost a perfect match for it, is a hard thing for them to. It doesn't easily work in a marketing scenario.
Yeah.
Marketing, the marketing people they launch a new product every 6 months. They want to have something to sell it on. So if you go back before 3D, Sony were desperate to persuade us to adopt a wider colour gamut and use XV-YCC, XV colour as the next thing that they could market to their products, as having this wider colour gamut. And we had to sort of explain to them that, yeah, XV-YCC, XV colour was a means of conveying a wider colour gamut signal to the home, but it wasn't a standard to which we could make TV programmes, because there was no defined display display. It was a sort of an unbounded display that could do any colour gamut you wanted, and if you were making a TV programme, you would have no idea of what it was going to look like on the display, because the display was undefined. Whereas the current television system, the display is defined, and the display it is defined for is the display in the television studio. It's the monitor in the television studio is the definition of the television system, which is an interesting situation, because in theory it's all written down in international standards documents as to exactly what the display standard is, or what the television standard is. But in practice, it's actually what the display does that is the definition of the TV system. And in the change from the cathode ray tube to all the different types of flat panel displays, we've had to write down what the cathode ray tube actually did, because it was never actually written down, not accurately enough to define the system. So that's been a large part of my work for the last 5 years, is actually trying to get international agreement as to what the TV system actually is. So moving forward, if the display becomes something else, how do we move the TV system to keep up with that? So, yes, Sony wanted us to move to a wider colour gamut, and we just had to explain to them that, well, we couldn't actually do that. Then they realised that moving to 3D was what they wanted to do, because all of a sudden technology had developed and they could do these stereoscopic 3D displays with glasses. Could the broadcasting industry respond to that and produce material? Now, Sky saw an opportunity to take a sort of market lead and produce 3D content and such like, and it had come in the cinemas, but, well, even 2011, there were, 47 Hollywood films made for 3D. Well, except some of them weren't made for 3D, they were made for 2D, and then they realised they needed to jump on the bandwagon, and so Alice in Wonderland had a bit of 3D added, and the rest of it was converted. And Avatar had a budget of £200 million, and you can't make a TV, no TV programme has ever had a budget of 200 million. They range from £5,000 an hour up to maybe £150,000 an hour. I mean, Downton Abbey might be a bit more, but it gets nowhere near a Hollywood budget. And trying to do 3D well on a restricted budget is really hard. So you can do it to a certain extent live. So Sky have concentrated on movies that they can get in already done in 3D, and sports, which is done live, so the costs are constrained because you have to get it right straight away and it goes straight out as it is. So you spend a lot of money trying to get it right, but you don't then spend weeks in post-production putting right all the defects of the 3D to make something that is going to go into the cinema. It goes out once and is seen and has a 3D effect. And we've done some work with Sky on this as well, because, I mean, that's the interesting thing as an engineer. Commercially, Sky and the BBC are obviously going head-to-head. As engineers, I talk to the guys at Sky very closely, and we work together on international standards and making sure that the BBC programmes work on the Sky platform and that it all works together, because we're actually all trying to do the same thing, so we have to work together, and it works very well. So that's why I like being an engineer. But the commercial reality is that, yes, these display manufacturers want to push the next generation of kit, so they've pushed out 3D ready displays, and those 3D ready displays have sort of left the consumers a bit nonplussed, really. There's not that much content out there. We did We've done 2 Wimbledons in 3D as experiments. We got involved with the Olympic stuff in 3D. We've done Strictly Come Dancing final in 3D, but there isn't huge enthusiasm amongst the consumers for it. The Olympics opening ceremony we broadcast in 3D to whoever wanted to receive it, and I think there were about something like 1 million 3D ready TV sets in the UK that could have received it. Your picture's frozen. I just.
Oh, really?
You are still there, yes?
Yes, I'm still here.
Yes. So there are about 1 million, or in the middle of last year, it's probably about 2 million now. Sales are enormous, but people aren't buying them specifically to watch 3D. They just, the TV sets happen to do 3D.
Yeah.
So of the 1 million TV sets that were out there, about 30,000 of them were used to watch the opening ceremony in 3D, which is a very small number.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, I was incredibly involved with the super high vision, the 8K version of ultra high definition coverage of the Olympics last year.
Yeah.
And we did that to 3 different venues in the UK, 3 venues in Japan, and 1 in the States. And over the 3 weeks, we showed it to nearly as many people as watched the opening ceremony in 3D. And we only had it in 7 different venues around the world.
Wow.
So yes, our feeling is that ultra high definition 4K, 8K is much more significant than 3D. 3D, you go back to 100 years ago, before the movies started to go 3D. Before the movies started to have sound, they were doing 3D, and then they discovered that sound was actually much more interesting than 3D, so they concentrated on sound. There was a big push to do 3D in the 1950s. The coronation was shot in 3D, and around the Festival of Britain there was a lot of interest in 3D, and then it dwindled again because actually it wasn't that good. And then Jaws 2 was done in 3D in the 1970s, and it was all going to be big, and 3D was going to be the big thing, but it wasn't then. Now it is sort of working in the cinema, but actually, there were 47 3D releases in the cinema in 2011. Last year there were only about 30, so it's actually shrinking again. And it hasn't really taken off on TV. My prediction about 3 or 4 years ago was that actually it wasn't going to take off until it worked glasses free, and actually that wasn't going to be really effective for about another 15 years, because looking at the development of display technology, you could see that in about 15 years' time, the resolution of the displays will be such that you can get really good sort of holographic quality, look around, be able to see everything 3D. But you're still going to have the problem that 3D is going to be in a space in front of you. So if you've got an 80-inch TV set, you are cramming the whole of an Olympic stadium, the whole of a football stadium into that 80-inch screen. And so things can never be the same as actually being in that stadium and looking into that space in the stadium itself. You're not going to be able to create that volume to make a realistic thing as though you really are there. Which you can do are the demonstrations of 3D. I remember being at an international exhibition, what was that, 5 years ago, and we were showing 1080p 50, so something beyond what we're able to broadcast at the moment. And there was one of these screens, and hardly anyone had seen it around the world. They'd all got used to high-definition television with interlace or lower resolution. We were showing this 1080p 50, and people were walking past it and saying, "Oh, is that 3D?" No, no, it's just really good 2D. And the super high vision, the 8K stuff we did around the Olympics, the screen is enormous. It's like being in the cinema, but with a much sharper image than in the cinema, and it gave a real impression of being there. But what we could do at the Olympics was only done at 60 frames a second. But even so, it gave you a much greater impression of being there. And yeah, people sort of said, well, yes, it's so much more realistic than 3D, because actually stereoscopic 3D is only one depth cue, and there's about half a dozen other very important depth cues that the brain uses to work out how far away things are. And if you just make the picture more realistic, actually the eye and the brain start to explore the image far more. So it has problems. If you present something a lot more lifelike, the brain sort of says, right, I want to be able to focus on that thing in the distance or that thing really close to you. And it expects to get the depth of field that where the eye chooses the depth of field that it wants to focus on, rather than the director having chosen the depth of field. In the same way as in 3D, if you pull focus in 3D, you're actually sort of trying to pull the eyes and persuade the eyes to focus on something that, and the eye says, I want to pull that into focus, but it's going out of focus, what's going wrong? In 2D, the brain doesn't seem to do that, because it's not, somehow the brain knows it's a flat image, but as it gets more realistic, I think we're going to need greater depth of field. So there's also, I think, going to be a change between, a bigger split between filmmaking in a filmic style, telling a story which is 24 frames a second, 25 frames a second on television or whatever, and more realism in sports coverage. I don't know which natural history has gone to a filmic story making, so sort of beautiful scenery and beautiful pictures of animals running and such like documentaries have gone in the film style because it's telling a story. Something which is more realistic is a completely different way of telling a story. And a higher frame rate and super high vision and ultra high definition going to 120 frames a second. This is something I did a lot of work on 5 years ago. And we're just picking it up again because there's a lot of international interest in it. We're going to a higher frame rate, which makes it a lot more realistic. The movement is more realistic. Sports, as you go to a higher resolution, the problem is if you don't go to a higher frame rate and a shorter shutter opening, all motion blurs out. So what we found in the early days of high definition was that as you panned the camera, everything went soft because you'd got more pixels being averaged in each frame as you panned the camera. And then when you stopped the camera, it all went sharp. And then because of the aperture correction in the camera, it went really sharp. So that was fine, apart from the fact that when you moved the camera again, it went soft, and then it went sharp, and then it went soft, and then it went sharp. And in sports coverage, you don't have the control of the camera motion that you have in a film, because says, I must have eaten something poisonous. and if you've eaten something poisonous, you should be sick. And that is not the effect you want from watching television. So we discussed this with Sky and came up with the conclusion that yes, what you needed to do was stop it going soft and then sharp. So by shortening the shutter, you stop the pan going so soft, and by reducing the amount of aperture correction in the camera, because after all, high definition has that native resolution without having to boost it extra in the camera in the way that was done in standard definition. You reduced that difference between the softness during motion and the sharpness when it stopped moving. Now, as you go to 4K and 8K, that becomes much more important. So you need to go to a higher frame rate, and that does work, and it produces absolutely stunning pictures, which we're only just starting to be able to demonstrate, because high frame rate displays are very difficult. We've cobbled together a thing with two 3D projectors, and we can get up to 200 frames a second, but it's a really awkward display setup to have two projectors overlaying the images, trying to synchronize the projectors, and it's been a bit of a trial, so we're looking at other ways of doing that. But anyway, that's by the by. Now the question then is whether you need to go above 120 frames a second, and I've done a lot of work, and I worked with the Japanese guy who was working with at NHK to try to persuade his management that they needed to go above 60 hertz, and the work he did showed that 120 hertz was enough to, with a short shutter, so you need a 300th of a second shutter, a very short shutter, to stop the motion blurring. But if you did that at 50 hertz or 60 hertz, it would mean that the image would judder very badly. So you need to take the frame rate up, and above 120 hertz, above 100 hertz, the eye can then track the motion smoothly, so that even if the individual frames look as though they're separate frames, the eye integrates that into smooth motion. Now, the eye can't do that for rotating motion because the eye doesn't rotate. And if there are two motions moving across each other, the eye can only track one of them, so the other one may judder. So we need to understand what effect that is. The Japanese have said, well, only 0.1% of television isn't covered by a simple motion. Well, one of the things the Japanese tend to do is decide what the answer is and then work out what the question should be to ensure they get the right answer. That's something I've learned over the years, but yes, certainly there is always there's a cost to going beyond what is really necessary for 99% of the material, and there is a trade-off to say, okay, 0.1% or 1% of television material won't be satisfied by this new system, but actually to satisfy that you would need to go so much further. It would cost 10 times more, and you've got a diminishing return, and you have to decide what's practical. And the Japanese, if there's one thing they're good at, it's deciding what's practical and then going for it, and that's what they've always done. That's what they're very good at. So the Japanese have decided that 120 hertz, and they've got that written into the international standards documents now. And we're now saying, can we use 120 hertz in Europe? And then we're starting to see the problems with lighting flicker with 120 hertz that you wouldn't have at 100 or 150 hertz, because we've got 50 hertz mains lighting. And what's going to happen if we try to convert 120 hertz to 50 hertz for HD footage? What happens if we try to convert HD footage at 50 up to 120? So there are all those questions which we're just grappling with at the moment. But the reason one of the things I put in that sort of technical overview is also there's the difference between 120 or 60 and 59.94, and that goes back into the history in American broadcasting, where they discovered that when they added colour to the NTSC system, they got some interference with the audio carrier that they'd got, so they shifted the frame rate by this factor of 1,000 over 1,000 to 1. And so instead of 60 hertz, they have 59.94. And so the proposal from the Japanese is that we should ditch that fractional frame rate and go to 120.0 rather than 119.9 or whatever it is. And that's all well and good as well, but actually the Americans are now looking at it and saying, that's going to be really awkward. So there's going to be, I think, certainly there's an international standards meeting next week that we are putting in a proposal that there needs to be a study of other frame rates other than 120 for ultra-high definition. And I think there's going to be a push from the Americans to have the fractional 1,000 over 1,001 frame rates as well. So so super high vision or ultra high definition is sort of standardized but not yet standardized. Now the other interesting thing, yes, the manufacturers are making 4K displays, but they're not making ultra high definition displays, because ultra high definition is a lot more than just 4K. There's the question of the frame rate. So the first 4K displays that are being released only work at 25, 30 frames a second. They don't work at 60, 50, 60, 120 frames a second. The consumer industry is doing what it can at the moment, and that's not the whole thing. And then there's the question of the colour space. So that's why that document I've sent you has got a lot of things in it, because they're all the first page is all the prehistory, and the last page is all of the current things that are in the standards, some of which the displays industry and the consumer industry haven't yet got to grips with, like the wider colour space and how you deal with that, the higher frame rates. Constant luminance is an interesting one, which actually you can forget about, because we're coming to the conclusion that it's too hard. And whilst it's theoretically better and will give us better efficiency and such like, the difference is so marginal, it's not worth changing every television system in the world to cope with it. It's just too hard. So and then there's the question of the audio, where with high definition we're getting to 5.1 surround sound with everything in high definition, but it's really quite hard. But then the Japanese are saying for super high vision they want 22.2 surround sound. You always want a bigger number. That's the marketing people always want bigger numbers, and that's quite hard, because actually we're not sure we really want a 24-channel audio system. It's not practical in most people's homes. We've been looking at ambisonics, other forms of spatial audio. So there's an awful lot that's not yet standardised, and yet the consumer industry are trying to sell these TV sets. We did some tests earlier this year to see whether people could see the difference between HD and 4K material on 4K screens, and the conclusion of those tests was, yeah, there's a very tiny difference, but it's not as big as the difference between standard definition and high definition, and that's not a very big difference. what makes the difference in going to ultra high definition is not just the resolution, it's everything else. Anyway, I've probably done enough talking, and are there any other things?
Yeah, I did have some questions. It said,
Yes.
I emailed my supervisor, and he said that the BBC had said recently that 3D broadcasting as a service doesn't look like it's ever going to take off.
Yes. We're partway through a 3-year trial of 3D. The broadcast side of that has finished because we were using the BBC HD channel for those experiments, and that has now been converted into BBC 2 HD. And, I mean, as far as broadcasters across Europe are concerned, and the BBC is fairly advanced in converting its services to HD, and we'll be doing news in HD and BBC 3 and BBC 4 and CBeebies and children's in HD later this year, next year. So that's all well in preparation. And across the whole of Europe, all the public service broadcasters are investing what money they have, which isn't a great deal because public service broadcasters never have quite as much money as they'd really like. And the investment has gone into HD, and 3D came along, and people said, can we afford? Well, we can't afford to invest in that, so let's ignore that for the moment until we've got HD done. 4K, yeah, what are we going to do? So, I mean, in the BBC, we've had a bit more ability to do experiments, so we've done some experiments on 3D, and the fact that so few people actually seem interested in watching it is sort of leading us to the conclusion that it's expensive to do for really very little benefit, and the consumers really don't like putting glasses on to watch television. If you've got glasses already like I have, then you have to put another pair of glasses on. If you don't wear glasses, you're not used to wearing glasses and you don't really want to wear them. And there is that resistance. So maybe when we get through glasses-free displays, and we're starting to see glasses-free 3D displays, but they're still not really that good. As you move your head around, the 3D effect comes and goes, and sometimes it reverses as you move from one sweet spot to the next. I first saw 3D TV when I was out in Japan. The Japanese were working on it 19 years ago, and they had the TV set came with a couch with headrests that made sure that you couldn't move your head. So that was not going to work. And the conflicts between depth cues, between the stereoscopy and the other depth cues, are what tend to give you headaches. The Italians have concluded that the official Italian advice is that children under 6 should not watch 3D TV. We've upped and hard about that and what the effect on children might be, and consulted medical people, and it's very hard to get anyone to be conclusive about it. The first child psychologist I talked to about it said that she thought actually children's brains would cope with it rather better than adults' brains because they're more adaptable. Which sort of surprised me, but thinking about it, yes, actually that's true. And then, but actually would that lead to children growing up with a distorted view of the real world, because the real world isn't quite like stereoscopic television? So that's the other danger, that maybe the Italians have taken this view. So it's something that we started to think about, and then it became apparent that actually 3D wasn't going to take off, so we sort of stopped worrying about it and got on with other work instead. So yes, I think it's 3D is not an issue anymore because it's just quietly going to go away another 15 years.
Do you think there's a fear that ultra-high definition might have the same sort of bubble and then burst sort of thing?
Yes, I think if people buy these displays, I mean, the thing is, we're not going to be in a position to broadcast 4K material for some time, but you can already get 4K YouTube videos. But you could get 3D YouTube videos, but actually, because they're not that good, and actually YouTube, the bandwidth needed to transmit a 4K video over YouTube or iPlayer or whatever is really hard to achieve. I mean, getting there now, I've just switched to BT Infinity and it doesn't cost any extra, but actually what it gives me more is a higher upload speed than a download speed. A better increase in upload speed.
Yeah.
Yes, bandwidths are increasing, and actually one of the things the BBC had to do, because for the Olympics we had 24 channels on satellite, Sky freed up some bandwidth that we were able to use for broadcasting Olympics, 24 channels for the Olympics, and we did the same on iPlayer. And part of that was we had to pretty much double the backbone capacity of the UK's internet infrastructure and to be able to deliver 24 channels of HD over the internet to expected demand. And that was one of the things that was part of the last licence fee settlement, that the BBC had to put some of the licence fee money into broadband infrastructure. But to be able to do that for real sort of millions and millions of people taking that up across the country, that would be beyond us, I think. The investment in infrastructure. I mean, the great thing about broadcasting is we put up one transmitter tower at Crystal Palace, and that covered 13 million people. Then we put up a second one, and that covered another 8 million people. And then we put up a third one. Okay. You cover 90% of the UK population with 20 transmitters. And then we have another 1,000 transmitters, which take that from 90% up to 99.8%. But that's only 1,000 transmitters and 1,000 signals. Now, to send over the internet a high-resolution image to 15 million homes is far more than the UK's infrastructure can cope with at the moment. It will get there. But there's an interesting difference between the UK and Germany. In Germany, penetration of cable is incredibly high, and they're giving up doing HD on terrestrial television because everyone has cable. Whereas in the UK, 2 million households have cable, 4 or 5 million have satellite, but everyone has terrestrial. So the balance of importance in the UK, terrestrial is incredibly important, which is why we ended up leading the international standardisation for DVB-T2, the method of getting HD over terrestrial broadcasting, because we were the first country that wanted to do it, because terrestrial was so much more important to us than it is in most other countries. So we had to do the technical work to lead that international standardisation to introduce HD on terrestrial. Now the Japanese are looking at that for 4K, for 8K, for super high vision, and are thinking of introducing some services in a relatively few years' time. Quite whether
much, and it seemed like they were, a lot of companies were installing fibre to people's homes because they had tax incentives to do so.
Right. Yes. Whereas in this country we've gone for fibre to the roadside rather than fibre right into the home.
Yeah.
Which is more economic. I mean the cable companies historically spent an incredible amount of money cabling up the country, but the take-up was so low that's why the separate cable companies all ended up amalgamating into one company, because they had to restructure financially to cope with the fact that the take-up was relatively low. So, yes, 4K and displays. So, yeah, I mean, is it going to go the same way as 3D? Yes, there is that danger. We're starting to use 4K cameras in production, but actually, most of the 4K cameras that are out there, they may have 4,000 photo sites horizontally, or 5,000. The Red has 5,000 horizontally, but they're in a Bayer pattern, so they don't give you 4K resolution. They give you about 2/3 of that because it's not the traditional television camera would have three 4K chips, one for red, one for green, and one for blue. And these modern 4K cameras have just one sensor with red, green, and blue patterned in a Bayer pattern, and so there's more resolution in green than in red and blue, which sort of matches the human eyesight, but not quite, because the human eye is incredibly clever, and the human eye, and this is why some of what I sent to you goes into details of sort of chrominance subsampling and such like, because that's what the human brain and eye does. The human eye has red, green and blue sensors, but in the back of the eye is effectively a matrix, a camera matrix, that converts it into luminance and chrominance. And if the television system can match what the human eye does, then we get better efficiency. And so that's what we try to do, and that's why we have chrominance subsampling and reduced bandwidth for the chroma channels. But the television camera finds it really hard to do that. They're not really doing that. So, yes, the television cameras are not really 4K resolution. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is that what we will start to do, and in fact what we're already starting to do, is to make a few programs in 4K. We're already shooting the next big natural history program in 4K, because we're shooting it now and it's going to be released in 4 years' time. And if we don't go to cutting edge technology now, in 4 years' time it will be outdated, because they're those big natural history programs that nobody in the world does quite like BBC Bristol. To keep ahead of everyone else in the world, you have to be there at the cutting edge of technology. So they are doing that. And we're starting to do some dramas with 4K cameras, but we're actually only taking HD out of the camera. So it may be a 4K camera and it makes a really good HD picture. It makes a better HD picture than an HD camera because it's got a higher resolution sensor. In the same way as an HD camera, because we're now making our programs in HD, our standard definition programs have never been better, because the cameras are HD, the displays are HD, and the signal path in between is not HD, but actually it's capable of conveying a lot more information than you would get if you just counted the pixels.
Yeah.
So we have the best standard definition we've ever had because we've got HD cameras and HD displays. We will get the best HD we've ever had by having 4K cameras and 4K displays. So that's... It sort of sounds like a justification for not investing in 4K transmission, but in practice we're not going to be able to, practically, for some years. Now the side of it is HEVC, high efficiency video codec, the next generation of coding system, which I think I saw an email yesterday saying that the draft specification had now been released for that. It's in the final stages of standardization. So I don't know how much you know about video compression.
Well, it's something that we have been taught at university, so I understand the basics at least.
Right, of MPEG-2, MPEG-4 AVC.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting. The very first project I worked on straight out of university 25 years ago was digital video coding of what eventually, 10 years later, became MPEG-2. So it's sort of been fascinating for me personally to watch it develop over the years, and I've dabbled in it a bit since, but what I did 25 years ago, there were sort of three of us in the BBC investigating, oh, this looks interesting, and motion compensated video compression, with block coding. Actually, that turned into eventually MPEG-2, and HEVC and MPEG-4 halved the bandwidth compared to MPEG-2. HEVC halves the bandwidth again, really, compared to H.264. So it is what's necessary to go to the next, to 4K or 8K. HEVC delivers the compression efficiency we're going to need. The interesting thing being the way it degrades, in that, I mean, the problem with MPEG-2 was as you reduce the bit rate, you get more and more blocky artifacts. H.264 improved on that in that as you wound the bit rate down, it started to lose definition. Rather than going blocky, the edges were smoothed somewhat. HEVC goes even further, and as you reduce the bandwidth, it really just reduces the resolution. So the danger is that as people try to reduce there's always this pressure to reduce the bandwidth to make fit more channels into the bandwidth that's available. So you end up reducing the resolution. So you may have a 4K transmission system, but actually the pictures that you're getting out of the far end may actually be no better than high definition. Although the more information you have at the coder, the better the compression will be. So if you've had a 4K signal and you've compressed it, it will look better than an HD signal compressed to the same bit rate because you've had more information to start with. That's sort of counterintuitive to start with, but then actually when you think about it a bit more, having seen it in the flesh, you then think about it a bit more and it starts to make sense that if you start off with more information, you can throw more information away, but you've had more information to start with, so there's a better chance of preserving the important parts of the picture than if you didn't have that information to start with. Okay.
Just as a question, how many years in estimate do you think it will take before ultra high definition becomes, I'm going to say, commonplace? So perhaps there are some channels with it, people have the TVs.
That depends on what ultra ultra high definition is.
Ah, right. It's still
Because, yeah, there will be, people are starting to get 4K displays now. And the fact, I mean, they're very expensive at the moment, but looking back at how displays have developed over the years, I think they'll be commonplace within 5 years. Once they're commonplace is when we have to start, we have to actually broadcast to them.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to say. And we're always in this interesting situation in the BBC that when high definition was 10 years away, we could do whatever work we wanted on it, we could talk about it, we could say it's 10 years away, we could say the BBC has no plans to broadcast it. And then it got sort of controversial and we weren't allowed to say anything because the BBC was not going to do it, because the BBC couldn't afford to do it and we were not going to do it, and you had to stop working on it because we weren't going to do it. And then we knew that it was going to happen, so we carried on working on it, and we, instead of calling it high definition, we had to call it technical quality evolution and whatever, and kept on working on it because we knew that it was going to happen, because these things always do. And then I was at a meeting with guys from Sky discussing display technology, and the guy from Sky came in and said, Jamie Murdoch came in last week and said, how long would it be before we could launch high definition? Right, I want it launched in 18 months' time. And yeah, and as soon as Sky announced they were going to do it, the BBC then had to say, right, what are we going to do? Now we didn't, so we then suddenly had to switch back on to doing HD. So we knew it was coming, so a good job we'd carried on working on it. Now 3D was different. Sky announced they were going to do it, and our advice had been, it's actually rather harder than that, and are people going to want to watch it? And actually, yeah, be careful. He was very cautious about 3D, and that's turned out to be the right thing to do. 4K, no, I don't think, we don't have the reservations about 4K that we had about 3D. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. I mean, the nice research idea was that actually you want to move to a significant step forward, and the difference between HD and 4K is relatively small, so what the Japanese are doing and looking at 8K super high vision is actually the right thing to do, and we're doing HD now. In 10 years' time we'll move to ultra high definition in 8K, but is that actually going to work? I think Sky and the cable companies will do 4K. The BBC will probably follow suit. But we don't know. Nothing's been decided. And the fact I'm allowed to talk to you means that nothing's been decided.
Yeah, of course.
It'll have been decided, but nobody can talk about it.
Yeah.
BBC has this strange way of working, but it's very. So at the moment, it's very, very uncertain.
Yeah.
But we are working very hard behind the scenes to try to make sure that the international standards are in place to do it properly, rather than the consumer industry just want to rush in and get the next thing to help them sell TV sets, because sales of TV sets are now going down.
Yeah.
Enormous boom with the introduction of HD, larger panels.
Mm.
And that boom is coming to an end. They're not... the display manufacturers want the next big thing, and their next big thing was going to be 3D, and that's sort of enabled them to, well, it was a marketing thing, but actually the consumers weren't greatly enthused by it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, 4K, well, yes, we shall see.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very difficult to predict.
Yeah.
But I think, actually, the big thing was going to a larger screen, going to a flat panel. There was something interesting about that flat panel that made people think. I went to displays conferences and they talked about the, well, it was called the wife acceptance factor. Would the wife allow you to have as big a display as you wanted in the home? And we decided during the course of the conference that it ought to be called the significant other acceptance factor. Significant other factor of acceptance, or otherwise known as the sofa. Because actually, it is, and that is how it's sort of worked out, that people have just accepted larger screens into their homes because it's not that big box in the corner of the room that sticks out into the room. It's actually something that fits against the wall and doesn't intrude so much and is actually very appealing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you haven't seen the same in loudspeakers. Surround sound, what's really popular are the really small surround sound loudspeakers, and you never get a decent sound quality out of a small loudspeaker.
Yeah.
But nobody wants, we've got some superb monitor loudspeakers that are a foot across, 2.5 feet high and a foot front to back. And if you have a surround sound system with 5 of those, it's absolutely stunning, but nobody would ever have that in their home.
Yeah.
So you have to always temper what's feasible in the home. What from a technical point of view would be fantastic, and give you the best sound and the best picture with what people actually want.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back 8 years, I thought TV sets would get bigger, and they would get to sort of 36, 40 inches maybe. But actually, 40 inches is now a very popular size, and 50 inches and 65 inches, and 1 or 2 people are buying 84-inch TVs.
Yeah.
Now, in 10 years' time, will everyone have 84-inch TVs? Or will they actually be built into the fabric of the room, and you'll have TV on one and Twitter on another, or will you just watch it all on iPads? Who knows?
Yeah.
It's really hard to predict. Will screen sizes carry on getting bigger, or will people say, no, that's too overpowering in the living room?
That seems to be a general consensus on the sort of expected screen size of ultra-high definition TVs. 84 inches, I took out a tape measure to measure exactly how big that was for my own sort of knowledge, and it is huge. It would absolutely dominate any room that it sits in.
It is, and I watched the opening of the Olympics in super high vision on a 105-inch screen, and it was absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
Would you want a 105-inch screen in your living room? Probably not. So, yes, it is. It's one of those things that, fortunately, from a broadcaster point of view, we don't actually have to decide just yet, because we are still rolling out HD. We've got 2 HD channels. We've got another 3 or 4 to go. I don't think Parliament will ever go HD. I mean, it's but we have to have a parliamentary channel because that keeps the politicians happy and they're important.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need to be in high definition. But everything else will go high definition. But it's taken 5 years to roll that out. And what's going to be next? When do we start rolling out a 4K channel? Yeah, that's we haven't started to think about that, quite frankly, because it's so uncertain as to exactly what it'll be. Whether it's certainly not needed yet. I mean, we can't spend we can't spend a disproportionate amount of licence fee payers' money on something for the richest 5% of the population, because we're a public service broadcaster. Sky can do that because they charge that top 5% who particularly want whatever it is. They can charge them a premium and deliver a premium service and pay for it that way. So we, public service broadcasters, are sort of always playing catch up, and we're lucky in the BBC that we may be playing catch up, but we're playing catch up from a position of being able to keep up in terms of the mass market. I mean, somewhere like Denmark, I mean, I go to European meetings because we're trying to standardise things across Europe, and Denmark's a country with a population the size of Wales. How can they don't have enough money to be able to do what we're able to in the UK. We're a quite good-sized country. The Germans, it's different again, because they have a federal system of government and a federal system of broadcasting where the country is divided into, I'm not sure, 5 or 6 regions, and the main broadcasters are split between those 5 or 6 regions. And more recently they have introduced some national broadcasters in Germany, and they're able, because they've covered the whole country rather than just a region, they've had that greater financial clout and been able to move a bit faster. But so always interesting.
Well, I think that's all of my questions answered.
Do come back. Feel free when you have some more questions.
Yeah.
Ask them again.
Fantastic. Yeah, that would be great.
A sort of two-way conversation was going to be much easier than trying to put it in email, because
absolutely.
Yeah, I could understand what you were after much more easily in a two-way conversation than if I just wrote a document like that one I sent today.
Yeah.
Not wanted.
Yeah. Well, no, that's absolutely fine. I'm getting quite close to the end of my dissertation now, so I'm really looking forward to having the final push. I'm interviewing someone tomorrow who is a freelance cameraman and director who works with all production companies and all channels and all sorts of things. And he is going to be filming a documentary in 6K very soon. And apparently he has filmed with the Red Epic cameras already for, I think, some news-related things. So I'm going to be interviewing him about how that all affects production and, you know, larger file sizes and editing and the more sort of production side of it.
I'm trying to think, what is that, the Sony F65?
I don't know. I asked him a bunch of questions in the email and he didn't answer, so maybe he's just waiting till we can talk.
Okay. No, we used the Sony F65, I think it must be, because that's the only camera with that goes beyond what the Red does in terms of resolution. We used that to capture some 4K test material, because actually a 6K or 7K Bayer pattern sensor delivers 4K full resolution, which we needed for test material, because it's no use having test material that doesn't fully exploit the standard. I mean, 20 years ago we were shooting experimental high definition stuff. We did 3 years at Wimbledon in the early mid-90s. It was great fun. But that test material that we shot in HD actually helped us develop widescreen and digital television, because it gave us the very best future-proofed test material for standard definition. So again, these 5, 6, 7, 8K cameras are what gives us the really good test material that we need to work on a 4K system.
Yeah.
So yes, anyway, what's his name?
Paul Angel.
No, I don't know.
No, but he's into factual and documentary making, so he does a lot of news items. I think he was approached by Dispatches to be a cameraman. I've previously worked with him on Crufts, which is one of his sort of more minor things that he does.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so that would be interesting, and I think that will give a different perspective than this one.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the nice thing about what I do is I get a complete overview. Some of my work's been involved in LED lighting and how that affects the TV cameras, and then the cameras and the lenses and the compression and the editing and the production, and then the play out and transmission and the display, and then into the human eye and the human brain. So I've been very fortunate that the way my career has worked out, I sort of cover the entire system, which is what you need to do looking at future standards. He'll be able to give a much more in-depth view of his part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is you all find fascinating, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Good.
Right, okay, well, I don't think I'll take up any more of your time.
No, thank you. It's always, I enjoy this because it gets me to think, and sometimes I get some thoughts out of these conversations, which